And we're back from break. Well, Heidi, it was so great for you to connect us to Dimitrios Economou. I am thrilled to hear all the great things that he's doing, but I am also excited because we have with us a Houston legend. The history guest that always comes on the show is someone that I introduce, but I know this is somebody very special to you, so I'm going to let you introduce our next guest.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm glad you're letting me because I really admire our guest. Alison de Lima Greene is the Isabel Brown Wilson Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Museum of Fine Arts. She has degrees in art history from Vassar, from NYU. She worked in European paintings at the Met. She's lectured at the Cooper Union. She's worked on books for everyone from James Turrell and Kenneth Noland to Jules Olitsky, Amy Blakemore, Mark Rothko, Julian Schnabel, Philip Guston, and most recently, Tamara de Lempicka. There is an amazing show at the Museum of Fine Arts that's up right now that we're going to talk about. Alison de Lima Greene, welcome to the Houston Hour.
Thank you so much, Heidi. It's a privilege to be here today.
Oh, we're so glad you said yes to the interview. So you came to Houston for your job at the museum?
I got a cold call in 1984, and very few New Yorkers grow up thinking, I got to get to Houston one day. But I was ready to sort of stretch my wings and live in another part of the country. So when Peter Marzio invited me down for an interview, I thought, where's the harm? So I came down, and Peter immediately convinced me that this was the place to be. And it has continued to be that place for 4 decades.
Did he have anything that you specifically remember that made you think you really should be here?
I just love the sense of possibility. We were a young staff. Peter seemed very grown up to me, but I realized he was in his 40s, maybe. Mm-hmm. There was an amazing team he had put together already, as well as some very distinguished people. Ann Tucker was famous for her work in photography.
My goodness, I have such a high opinion of her.
When I was in New York, I was working for someone called Gary Tintereau at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he was a native Houstonian. And he very kindly said, when I was letting him know that I was tending towards another possibility, his first comment was, I'll kill you. His second comment was, let me show you how to move to Houston. He introduced me to amazing people. Edward B. Mayo was one of the first people I sought out at Gary's advice. I met so many people who loved this city. Ralph McKay was another, our curator and director of our film department. It just opened up to me.
I've met Ralph.
Yes.
He gave me a tour one time. I was in Marfa. Fun story. We were in the Dan Flavin part of Marfa, and it was a huge lightning storm, and all the lights went out, and we had to shelter in place. And I've been a docent in various museums, and he was explaining that out at the Chinati Foundation, which is what we think of when we think of Marfa, their docent training included how to deal with being struck by lightning, rattlesnake bites, being stung by a scorpion. But we ended up hanging out for, I'm sure, more than an hour in there, and it was with Ralph.
Yeah, he's a remarkable man. He now is doing film programming with Ballroom Marfa while also still maintaining ties with the Rotterdam Film Festival.
Wow, and fun fact, that night he invited me to a party I just remembered, and that's where I met Richard Linklater.
So you are all connected. But to get back to Houston, we're having so much fun with Tamara de Lempicka and all the connections she has here.
Oh my goodness, I had no idea. Her daughter, Cosette, lived a mile from my gallery on Reba.
Yes, I pass the old Regency House high-rise where she had an apartment.
That is a great building.
And even closer, she lived for a year before she got the apartment at the Regency at what was then, of course, the Warwick Hotel.
Yeah, you have had a series of wonderful events involving her granddaughters and her great-granddaughter. I've gone to a number of them, but the show is really important. It's the first American retrospective of Tamara de Lempicka. Can you talk about her? I think a lot of people are familiar with her work when I show them pictures of her wonderful Art Deco work, but maybe they didn't know her name.
So I should, first of all, give credit to my colleagues. The Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco took on the mammoth task of organizing the show, led by their curator, Fiore Rinaldi. Fiore studio brought on board the amazing curator Gioia Mori. And the saddest part of this experience was that Gioia passed away this January. She did get to see the exhibition when it opened in San Francisco, and she took great pride in that. I got a chance to talk to her then. I got a chance to congratulate her. I also knew that she probably wouldn't be able to come to Houston, though. This was the capstone of her career. She'd spent more than 3 decades devoted to Lempicka, taking her from just being a sort of pop icon to being seriously understood as an artist in Europe, in Japan, and it was time for her to be understood in the United States.
Yeah, a country where she lived since the 1940s.
On and off. She did keep an apartment in Paris, and then she spent the very last years of her life very happily in Cuernavaca.
So there's a beautiful book that came out with it as well, and I understand that the exhibition at the de Young Museum is a little bit different from the one at the Museum of Fine Arts. You added more objects, including things from the permanent collection of the museum. How's it different?
So the de Young Museum set a great example. They had some wonderful historic costumes and examples of Art Deco, but most of that material was in a sequestered, very dramatic tableau. I worked with Cindy Strauss, our curator here, to basically expand that presentation, sort of scattering it throughout our exhibition a little bit more generously than San Francisco. That was possible because our architecture is also different from San Francisco's. They had a very bold design. We had a more classic, modern, open space thanks to our very graceful Mies van der Rohe building.
Right.
So I wouldn't say that San Francisco wasn't doing a good job, but because of the nature of our building and its historic expanse, we could do something quite different from what they did. They did something quite different from what we could do. They had fabulous vignettes, great long vistas. They had a couple paintings that weren't able to travel. We were able to snag 3 major paintings that they weren't able to show. So,
is that because they were in Houston?
No, it was basically they weren't available. They had other commitments. But working with Cindy was really instructive. I knew some of the treasures in our collection. One of the joys of our curatorial structure is we all work in very close collaboration. So it wasn't a surprise to me that, for example, we had a beautiful Poré coat that we wanted to use, or a fabulous Art Deco wastebasket, possibly the chicest wastebasket ever made.
I saw that wastebasket. It's gorgeous.
But just the sheer volume of material, and a particularly nice surprise was how well we were able to integrate the theme of perfume. Tamara de Lempicka apparently loved good scents. According to her family members, she would enter a room and Chanel or other scents would come in with her. And thanks to the generosity of Alice Simpkins, we have a great historic collection put together by the Hogg family to honor the woman who then became one of our great patrons. In addition, Alice Hansen, when she got married to one of the Hogg brothers, they gave her, in the early 1930s, a fabulous collection of over 100 Art Deco perfume bottles. We have some of those.
I got to ask you, Mr. McKinney, were you aware of that?
Mike Hogg would be the brother specifically.
Yes.
We've interviewed on our show the author of the book about Alice.
No, Alice Hansen, that was her next marriage. She married Mike Hogg, and then the family celebrated the wedding with this sort of wonderful present. Then her niece, Alice Simpkins, inherited the collection and donated it to us. So it was the time when the whole world of design was changing, when you began to collect couture by names, and it wasn't just a Worth gown. That was, the great gown to own in the 19th century. But you had the Chanel gown with the Chanel purses, with the Chanel pin, with the Chanel scent. Lanvin and all the other houses, Schiaparelli, began creating a whole world of design to enshrine the modern woman. And at the absolute center of that was Tamara de Lempicka. And maybe we should go back and tell a little bit about her history.
I would love that. I'm sure our listeners would too.
So she was born in 1894. She often added maybe 10 years, or I should say subtracted 10 years from her birth date. Not the first woman or man to do so, but recent history unearthed her birth certificate. She was born most likely in Warsaw, when that area of Poland was part of the Russian Empire. And not long before that, the laws against Jews had been enacted across Poland and across the Pale of Settlement, which basically basically limited Jews' opportunities for travel, for business. The formerly more liberal policies were cut off. And so Lempicka's parents made a very pragmatic decision to convert to Christianity. She was raised as a Christian. She had brought her daughter, her only daughter, up as a Christian, although there's some question whether her daughter was baptized. We know that Lempicka was, but she kept it an absolute secret that she had Jewish ancestry.
Right.
Only recently has that been fully disclosed, and whenever anyone even suggested it to her, she would say hush, because not only was Tsarist Russia anti-Semitic, Bolshevik Russia was anti-Semitic, France in the 1920s was anti-Semitic, and we know what happened in the 1930s all across Europe. So that was one of the first of many disguises that Lempicka assumed. There's a lighter-hearted story about how she met her husband. She set her sights on this very handsome young lawyer who she met when she was about to begin her debut season in St. Petersburg, and she took one look at Tamara de Lempicka, also Polish, aristocratic and well-connected socially, working in law and banking, and she thought she was going to marry him. She caught his attention at a masquerade ball where she came dressed as a peasant girl. And as one often does, she had a live goose with her. I'm sure at your coming out, Heidi, you had a live goose with you,
You can
too.
be sure of that.
Absolutely. So did I. But no one ever forgot that about Lempicka. They were married in 1916, settled in St. Petersburg, ready to lead the high life of high social moment. But of course, we know what happened in 1917, the October Revolution. Lempicka and her daughter, her mother and her sisters fled to Paris. Tadeusz was held back. He was questioned by the police, suspected of Tsarist sympathies, which was probably true, but also of being a Tsarist spy, which may not have been true. He was lucky to get out of Russia alive. He joined his family in Paris, somewhat diminished, quite sad, and Lempicka, who had left with her jewels, only portable wealth she had to set up a new life, starting from scratch in Paris. And her sister had a similarly pragmatic outlook. She said, I'm going to become an architect. Why don't you become a painter? We'll work together. And Lempicka had a generous grandmother who had taken her across Europe to the museums and introduced her to art. She had taken arts lessons as a young girl. And when she came to Paris, she studied first briefly with Maurice Denis, but decided that his symbolist style was too old-fashioned. And she shifted her attention to the sort of post-Cubist modernism, studying with André Lotte, one of the second generation of Paris Cubists, who always said that great painting started with a figure. She learned how to command the figure with life drawing classes in his studio at the Académie Julienne. She also began to support herself at first with sketching fashion illustrations, but very quickly discovered that she had a talent for combining her deep knowledge of art history and classical art with a modern sensibility. And that kind of suave, classicizing modernity is now what we call Art Deco. She was the first and foremost painter of that movement, and the Art Deco movement didn't have the term Art Deco. That was applied many decades later, but it became codified as the style of the moment in 1925 when there was a huge Art Decoratif pavilions summer show that filled all of Paris. 2 million people saw the many displays that were put out. Lempicka was not included in that show, but she had her first solo show in Milan that same year. And before that, she had already jumped the barrier of getting into the official October salons. And that was incredibly important, too. And interestingly, the first time she was in a salon, she didn't submit the painting under her own name, Tamara de Lempicka. She used her husband's name, Monsieur Lempicka, because she thought a man had a better chance of being selected for an exhibition than a woman.
I found that so interesting. Is that unique in that choice? Have you encountered that before?
Oh, there are many people. Well, of course, think of George Eliot or many authors across the 19th century. The Bronte sisters were not published as sisters when they first put out their books. For artists, it took a little longer to gain a foothold. There were always exceptions. But into the 20th century, many women artists played down their femininity femininity because women artists were expected to be delicate, feminine, doing watercolors. Indeed, Lempicka's exact contemporary, Georgia O'Keeffe, was told by her husband and dealer, stop painting watercolors, which was sort of a shame because she did beautiful watercolors, because that's considered womanly. You can do great art being more masculine. And in a way, even though Lempicka might have become acquainted with O'Keeffe by the end of the 20s, when she visited America in 1929, they traveled a surprisingly parallel path. Although Lempicka was always the cosmopolitan European, and Georgia O'Keeffe was always the puritanical American.
Yeah, they couldn't have been more different. I would say with both of their work, I had spent a lot of time looking at it in pictures. Georgia O'Keeffe, there was that big book in the 80s that was too big to fit on the bookshelf, I remember. So a lot of people had it on their coffee table. I know I did. And then when I actually saw Georgia O'Keeffe's work in person for the first time, it was just mind-blowing. And I will say it was your show where I hadn't actually seen her work before in real life. I'd just seen it in pictures, and the surfaces and the colors and all that are just astounding.
And the same is true of Lempicka. She has gotten reproduced a lot. Unfortunately, we weren't able to borrow the painting that is perhaps most familiar to the general public, the auto portrait, or Tamara in a green Bugatti. That was not available. It's been posters everywhere. But in a way, not having the painting in the show makes you look more carefully at the other works. And what a touch she had. She often painted on wood panels with the precision of old master paintings, and yet the subject matter was exactly of the moment. You could look at a nude by Lempicka that evokes the sinuous forms of Titian or Ingres. In particular, she loved the work of Jean-Dominique Ingres from the first decades of the 19th century. But then you look again, and the model is wearing completely modern makeup. Plucked eyebrows, bee-stung rosy lips. And so there's this wonderful combination of what is of the moment and what is timeless.
I think the way she depicts eyes is very, very special, very otherworldly.
She knew that when she did portraits, if the portrait subject engaged with the viewer, there's the cliche, the eyes follow you around the room. That's not really what she does. The subject often looks piercingly out of the canvas, and you cannot look away. The first painting that she ever had in the Salon, 1922, it was titled rather obliquely, Woman in a Blue Dress. It was actually her lover, Ira Perrault. And that's the other thing that people are very intrigued about her nowadays. She was sexually fluid. She loved men. She adored women. Perhaps she loved women more intimately. She admired men for their power. She had many liaisons, and in Paris, at least, in the circle she traveled in, the so-called Café Society during the Jazz Age or the crazy years, les années folles, you could be free like that. Mm-hmm. And, of course, not everyone enjoyed that. Tadeusz did not want a freewheeling wife. He wanted one who would be more attentive to him, more conventional. And in 1929, their marriage ended when he moved back to Poland. But Tamara fought to keep their daughter, Kizette, and succeeded. And although Kizette was sent off to boarding school, as all well-brought-up young girls were, they became very important to one another. And ultimately, it was Kizette who, in the 1940s, married Foxy Foxhall and landed in Houston. That also firmed up the connection between our city and Lempicka.
I understand they owned that house for 50 years.
Yes, unfortunately, the house is now gone.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
We hope everyone in Houston who wants to see the show has an opportunity. She will take you back in time, and she is like a spaceship to another era, and yet she is so of our time as well. Her figures jump off the wall. They grab you by the throat. Once you've seen those paintings, you're not going to forget them, and you're going to want to see them a second time.
Some people are familiar with her work because Madonna famously collects her work and has included it in her Vogue video, in her world tour, and Barbra Streisand, of course, famously collected her work, but I think she has really not gotten the attention that she deserves in the United States, and I think this show is really going to do a lot to raise awareness about her and the works that she was doing. And I have to say, as someone who goes to every museum show, that show will go down in history as one of my favorite. I loved your Mark Rothko show. I love this one too. I think they're my two favorite shows I've ever seen at the museum, and I just want to congratulate you on putting on an amazing show and a fabulous book to go with it.
Thank you, Heidi. I'll put in one footnote. We're talking about how this is changing perceptions of her. Barbra Streisand did contribute to the catalog.
She
we were
did.
thrilled. But what I think is really nice was, just as we were opening the show, a young man got in touch with me from Florida, and he's going to do his doctoral dissertation on Lempicka.
And I think he was at the film that I was at, and you pointed him out in the crowd.
Yes.
That must have made him feel amazing.
Yes,
Well,
he came back to see it with his boyfriend. It was incredibly meaningful to him. I think the show is going to be meaningful to generations after us.
Well, we're close to being out of time, Alison, and I always ask this question to folks that have been in Houston for a long time, like yourself. Not a native, but certainly here enough to qualify for seeing our city grow and change over the years. Talk about maybe something that's gone from Houston, something that you missed, that was here when you first came back in 1984 and is no longer here.
Well, that would have to be the Shamrock Hotel. I do know that Lempicka had a membership to their pool. Of course, I wouldn't have overlapped with her. She had left Houston and gone to Cuernavaca before I arrived. But I did go to the Shamrock one night and was dazzled by the Shamrock Green bar, the details, the scale, that monster swimming pool with a high diving board. And I thought, I've got to come back. And then it was gone.
You're right. 87, they tear it down. It's no more. But I just love the idea of you got that opportunities like so few people have to really just be part of that. They call it the Riviera of the South here in Houston when Glenn McCarthy opened it up in 1949. And it really was a special place in Houston and Houston's history. And so many folks have great memories just like yourself. Well, this is wonderful. Now, where can people go to get information and tickets and learn more about the show?
Well, go to MFAH.org. That is the museum's website. We have special programs. We have lectures. There are social events. And, of course, never forget our film programs, which
Yes.
are so much fun. And so we have some summer shows coming up. So keep an eye out for new opportunities for delight, discovery. And like I tell everyone every summer in Houston, we always think about putting a banner in front of the museum that says, air conditioned.
That's the best part. You get to have the best of both worlds and enjoying comfort. Well, thank you again for joining us on the Houston Hour with Mr. McKinney and Heidi Vaughan. Houston, we're going to hand it over.
Thank you.
Take care.